Dajahao, Barry here. This will be the first, in essence, of my videos on trying to offer some perspectives on the situation in the world, especially and referring specifically to Ukraine, Russia, NATO, the US, Europe, and what I've found, I've been looking at this for several weeks now, and in fact months, because my interest in this goes back to 2014, which is a pretty significant date. There's a lot of talk. Everybody's suddenly an expert. Very few people actually are. I'm going to show you a video of somebody who knows more than most, and this perspective that I'm going to show you here is from somebody who's based in Russia as a, hang on, I'm going to pause. Excuse me, I will continue. This is a discussion, interview, if you like, between Paul Jay over the Real News Network and a man called Stephen F. Cohen. Now, Stephen F. Cohen is an American scholar of Russian studies, and his academic work concentrated on modern Russian history since the Bolshevik Revolution. He taught at New York University. He was a professor of politics at Princeton. So this is a guy who really does know his stuff, okay? So I'm going to play you some of this, and I try and find the relevant sections that will get you up to speed on the actual situation, okay?
I'm Paul Jay, and we're continuing our discussions with Stephen Cohen about Russia, the United States, and Trump and Putin. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
For Stephen's bio, just look under the video player, but watch the earlier segments. But I'll plug your book. People should read this book. It's important. It's called War with Russia, ? From Putin and Ukraine to Trump and Russiagate. I think your contribution on this issue is extremely important. I know you've been under incredible pressure and getting isolated on this point, and I think it's brave of you to take the stance you do. Okay, let's just move on. In the early years of Putin's presidency, the West quite liked him. I guess they thought he would be a continuation of Yeltsin. I think they had expectations that he would help facilitate an American, I don't know if the world takeover is too strong, but allowing American mining companies and energy companies and finance to come in. And instead, what emerged with a state with real laws and an oligarchy emerged, which I think at some point the Russian people will have to deal with, because I don't think it's good for them, but it's up to them.
So there's the introduction. The West generally were okay with Putin because they thought he was going to be a continuation of Yeltsin, who had become kind of their man and was agreeing to everything that they wanted, and all their plans for continued pillage of other countries, i.e. in this instance, Russia. Okay, we'll continue.
That being said, America didn't get a free-for-all. But as this relationship with the West became more and more tense, and I think to a large extent for these reasons, the Americans didn't get everything they wanted out of Russia, I don't understand why Putin didn't take more of the Chinese stance, which is avoid direct confrontation as much as you can and build up your strength. And I don't get Crimea threat. I know there was a right-wing takeover, a far-right takeover of Ukraine. The Americans certainly facilitated and helped engineer it. It is a kind of strategic threat. I mean, I think that's clear, and you've made the case very eloquently. But still, why poke Europe and the United States in the eye and kind of make the case of the anti-détente forces? Oh, look, you know, Russia's on the move. It starts with Crimea, and Georgia will be next, and then it will be the whole of Ukraine.
Of course, it didn't start with Crimea.
So, continuing, This is Stephen F. Cohen now.
And that's just the argument that people who don't wish to understand the Russian point of view make. It didn't start with Crimea. It began with the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders.
No doubt.
Well, not only no doubt, but for Putin and for the Russian political class, that was the context and the prism through which they viewed Western and particularly American policy toward Russia.
So you see here, Professor Cohen points out that this was, he's giving the Russian perspective, Putin and the Russian political class. They had to view things from their perspective, and their perspective was this, okay?
So when the Ukrainian crisis began in 2013, let's remember what happened, because it does lead to the annexation of Crimea. In 2013, the European Union told the then president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and he may have been a rotter, but he was constitutionally and legally elected. It would have been a clean election. He was the president. That he needed to sign an economic partnership with the European Union.
There you go.
It meant, in effect, losing his preferred trade status with Russia, which constituted about 40% of Ukrainian trade, not to mention about 3 to 4 million Ukrainians who worked in Russia to support their families, were allowed to do so and allowed to send their salaries back to Ukraine to support their families. So Ukraine was heavily dependent on Russia economically, and along comes the European Union that wants to exclude Russia from this new arrangement. So Putin and his foreign minister Lavrov say, look guys, why not a tripartite arrangement? It'd be good for everybody. We'll have an economic preferred agreement with Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. And Washington and Brussels said no.
So there you can see in 2013, Putin, Lavrov, Russia were trying to be diplomatic and come to diplomatic agreements and arrangements with all the concerned parties in this region, okay? And they were turned down by, as Mr. Cohen says, Washington and Brussels, okay? Fact.
Russia can't participate. Yanukovych, for that reason, declined to sign the agreement, and that led to the Maidan uprising. And Yanukovych flees from office to Russia. So, Putin now is sitting in Moscow, and Crimea comes to the fore because you've got a very right-wing, and I would say crazy government in power saying outlandish things, including, you know, Crimea is ours and we're going to expel the Russian naval base there, which was there by treaty. They had at least, I think, 25 years on the base. There were 22,000, by law, Russian soldiers on the Crimean base. They were already there. All right. So Putin's sitting here. He sees some kind of threat. Maybe it's rhetorical. But bad things are happening. This was a very violent uprising. You remember the burning buildings in Kiev and Maidan. If you watch this on TV, this was violence. It was very serious. Snipers killed, I think, 85 to 100 people on Maidan just before Yanukovych fled. They said that the snipers were sent by Yanukovych, but we now know they weren't. They were sent by neo-fascists, Ukrainian neo-fascists on Maidan. But
I'm going to pick this up here because I have 3 videos or maybe 6 videos that I've made from 2 videos that I found, which are pretty much bombshell evidence of the snipers being hired and brought in to create chaos during the EuroMaidan. Okay, so whether I put these online or whether I'll point you to the links if they still exist, I'll do this. Okay, so this is going to be a pause while I'm stringing all this together. So I'm recording online. Okay, so this will be a pause. Okay, so before I continue with this video, I think it's worth mentioning a couple of things that up to now, well, up to the other night, I had been looking at this from a geopolitical perspective, and of course, it's a lot wider than that because there are people involved in this. And I was speaking to a friend, dear friend of mine, who was living in Ukraine, and you know, he kind of made me. I had to pause and think about this whole thing because it's the people of these regions that are really suffering from all this stuff. So I've had to do some thinking and some consideration, and I will relate this to you. And I'm hoping to get my friend to have a chat with me online, and just to, not political, just so he can relate what life has been like, and that will be very enlightening for people, I believe. But I'm waiting to see. Obviously, his situation is not hasn't been very stable, and so I'm waiting to hear back from him now. But suffice to say, I'm happy to say that they're my friends in Ukraine. I have friends in Russia too. I'm happy to say that they're safe, and that's the main thing. So continue with this talk from Stephen Cohen. Okay. Also worth mentioning here that a lot of people are referring to a man named John Mearsheimer, who's very knowledgeable. There's no question about it. He's a very knowledgeable fellow, but he's a Brookings man and an ex-West Point guy, and you have to remember he has a certain amount of Anglo-Saxon conditioning which taints a lot of what he says. So, for example, he talks about the China threat, and as if he is part of the 1%. I don't want to use the word elite because they're not, but he does talk from the perspective of the white supremacist Anglo-Saxon kind of point of view. So there's a taint to what Mearsheimer says. I much prefer Mr. Cohen's version of things, and I will also be including a few other videos from other who I consider to be very knowledgeable people. So we'll proceed with this.
Uniting Crimea with Russia, because Crimea had traditionally been a Russian province. I think somewhere like, don't speak of ethnicity, speak of language. Something like 85% of the population speaks Russian as a native language. I mean, enormous number. It's a Russian province. And it was only an act of accident under Khrushchev that had been assigned administratively when the Soviet Union existed to Ukraine, because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So what was Putin supposed to do? So to the extent that we know.
So important point here, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So this is a history lesson here, and this man knows what he's talking about, okay?
How he made the decision. He was told by his intelligence people, all leaders in crisis depend on intelligence, that take Crimea today through a referendum and peacefully. And by the way, they were polling like crazy. They knew they'd get 85 plus. They knew this. If they had, and the referendum was completely open. All this crap about at gunpoint is nonsense. I mean, it was a fair referendum, and Gallup has been going back to Crimea and polling. They get the same number. 85% want to be with Russia. Putin is told, do it by the ballot box today or fight a war there tomorrow. That's what he was told. What would you have done in his place? See, it's easy for you, Paul, and me, Steve, to sit here and debate what leaders.
So again, history. I'm going to find the next relevant section. This is an entirely relevant interview. The whole thing is massively interesting, to me at least anyway, because this man does know what he's talking about, and he's talking from perspectives that you are not hearing anymore, because all Russian media has been blocked and banned and silenced by the West, who are marching in lockstep on this. The Pavlovian parrots. Russia's been silenced. There's no other voice. So you have to dig to get a perspective on this, okay? Mr. Cohen is one very learned fellow. So you have to remember that this whole thing is very foggy. The disinformation that's flying around is ridiculous. You have this so-called Russia bombed a nuclear reactor and it was on fire, and then this TV puppet clown Zelensky is saying, "Oh, Europe will need to be evacuated." So you know he's not telling the truth. At any point, he won't tell the truth because he's being paid not to. He's making too much money from this situation. Again, follow the money. So the whole thing's very foggy. Putin, in particular, has been demonized by the West, marching in lockstep. And the truth is, it's never been analyzed. The history of this and what Putin and Russia have had to do, what they were facing from ever-increasing threats from NATO. And Nazism, this is another issue. I'm going to come back to this in the next video, but it never really ended. It got shipped off. It moved house, if you like. It went to America and various places in Europe. We'll continue with the video.
I can just simply tell you what Putin was told as the alternative. One group said you have to take Crimea now. The polls show Crimeans will vote to join Russia. There is an international law that referendums are binding and legal. We could play. Go ahead and have the referendum. They will vote to join Russia, but that doesn't mean because they've requested to join Russia, we have to say okay. Just take that and say to the West, look, the Crimean people want to join Russia. We understand that that may be, difficult for you. Can we find a way to solve this problem, the Crimea? So Putin was told that was an option, and he didn't choose it. And I try to put myself in his shoes and say, what would I have done? And the problem is I don't know the intelligence. For example, there is a report, I don't believe or disbelieve it, that NATO commandos were found on Crimea, on the peninsula.
So this is an interesting point. NATO forces were found in Crimea at that point in time. This is before or just after, during the whole EuroMaidan thing in Ukraine. And I can tell you for a fact that NATO and US and Europe, UK forces are operating in Ukraine now. And I will do another video on this. This will be in the next video. So they've been insurrecting right from the beginning, okay, from a long time ago. Continuing.
I don't know if that's true. Maybe it was scuttlebutt. Did Putin know it to be true? I don't know. But we have yet to be told the whole story of what happened between the coup in Kiev, because it was a coup. It overthrew the president, and the decision. Russians don't say annex, they say rejoin with.
Rejoin.
Welcome Crimea home. To make that decision. One day we'll know more, and then we'll be able to decide if Putin really had a choice.
And I don't have any detailed knowledge about the situation.
I don't have enough.
Never mind.
The point is that Putin was told. Now, mind you, this is it's a good thing that he's a former KGB officer, by the way. Henry Kissinger, when he first met Putin, and he learned, this was when Putin was working as deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, and Kissinger met him. And Putin said to Kissinger, I began in intelligence, and Kissinger said, that's the best way to start a political career. Putin was in a position, I think, to evaluate the intelligence. So the question that you raise is true. Why didn't they wait? And he was told, we can't wait.
Do you think it's part
Events are moving too fast.
In the last segment.
Okay, so you have to put yourself in well, you don't have to, but looking at this from other perspectives, i.e. in this case, from Russia's perspective, the intelligence was telling them, we have to do something, okay? So I'm going to skip forward. If you bear with me, hang on, I'm going to pause.
So we're turning the clock back now to the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, we're going back into the early years of Putin. And then why not let Russia join the EU? Why not encourage this kind of mixing?
We got to get the history straight, or at least the history you're talking about. If you're talking about the decade, the 1990s, following the end of the Soviet Union.
I'm talking about when Putin comes to power.
Well, he comes to power in 2000.
Yeah. Okay, Okay, continuing with a history lesson from a Russian perspective in terms of what various presidents, and I'll be talking about, we're going back to Clinton here, which is important to know, okay?
That free-for-all had an American hand supporting Yeltsin through that whole period.
I mean, Clinton, unwisely, not only Clinton, Bill Clinton, Hillary, and Bill Clinton, who was president then in the 90s, believed that he was assimilating Russia with his policy toward Yeltsin. That's what he thought. And he was so advised by people such as Strobe Talbot, all of whom should have known better. In fact, Russia descended in the 1990s into the worst and most corrosive economic depression ever in peacetime. Men were dying at 57. I think the collapse of industrial production was greater than it was during our own Great Depression. People were not receiving their wages or their social benefits. The middle class was being vaporized. Gangs were controlling large parts of the economy. Some people even think it was what people call state capture, that private oligarchs had captured the state. Russia was on the verge, if not of actually breaking up, of collapsing. Now,
what Mr. Cohen, the point he's about to make is crucially and critically important, and it's a point about Putin and his cabinet, if you like. I'm not sure what the Russian term is, but his advisors. It's a very crucial and critical point that Mr. Cohen is about to make, and it should be noted, okay?
Flashback to that moment, 1999. Russia, the largest territorial country in the world, even after the end of the Soviet Union, laden, stockpiled with every conceivable weapon of mass destruction, from germ, bacterial, chemical, nuclear. What if Russia had broken up? What if? We're talking apocalypse now. I would think that people would give Putin a little credit for holding Russia together.
You see, Russia was in chaos. It was in severe and massive economic decline. It was broken up. It was being taken over by gangs of oligarchs and gangsters. And there were nuclear weapons, all kinds of weapons of mass destruction all over the place. Anything could have happened. And the point Mr. Cohen makes here is that the whole world really should give credit to Putin and his team, if you want to call them that, for holding Russia together. It's forgotten. This is a history we've forgotten.
Reestablishing control over the regions that had these weapons. But he's never given any credit. Russians themselves do, but in the West. Imagine what would have happened. Now, it wasn't just Putin alone. He put together a team, a commander, as it's called in Russia. No one man can do this. But he chose advisors who understood the situation. Thought that this would be the continuation of the 1990s, except that Putin would be a healthy and sober Yeltsin, that Yeltsin had become dysfunctional. But nonetheless, very soon American disillusion in Putin set in, and we can date it. There was then and remains today a New York Times columnist, Nicholas Kristof, who wrote, I think it was 2003, maybe I'm off a year and half a year, that he was greatly disillusioned, Kristof, that Putin had not turned out to be a sober Yeltsin. Imagine this. In other words, they, to the extent that columnists speak for these great powers, wanted Yeltsin, a person who by then had positive ratings in Russia of about 3%, who was hated in Russia for what had happened to the country. But the only grievance in Washington was he wasn't sober and healthy enough to continue the policy.
So you can see they were marching in lockstep then. So to continue, again, a history lesson, which is it's pretty important to understand this stuff if you're going to start, if you want to know what's going on, and to all the people out there in the Western social media who are all bleating about this and that and the other without actually having any clue about what's really going on. I saw a great quote that if you don't know what's been going on in Syria for the past 11 years, then you certainly don't know shit about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Okay, so continuing here. Okay,
to this day. Because even today you could read in the New York Times and other analyses, so-called, that how great it was under Yeltsin. It wasn't great. It was a country in agony. And it was dangerous to us with all those weapons. So, you know, we've discarded history. We've discarded real historical and political analysis.
Key point, we've discarded history. And this is the thing with propaganda, with the control of the masses, is whoever controls the media controls the history books. And this is the problem, is that most people have no understanding of the background to all this. I'm going to pause for a moment. Okay, continuing. Another major point here coming from Mr. Cohen. Again, worth paying attention to this, okay? Yeah, okay, he's going to be talking about the media, okay?
And are they going to credit Putin, the guy they've so demonized, as a partner to avert nuclear war? They will not. And what happens then? And the answer is nuclear war. That's why I say we're walking on a razor's edge with this Russiagate demonizing of Putin nonsense.
So, just going to conclude this. I think it's important. This is one of the most significant discussions and views I've seen on the whole thing. I've tried to take out or point to the most significant parts of this, that there are others. It's worth watching the whole thing. I'll provide the links. So continuing, and this I think is probably the most significant point made here. I'll play, okay?
Nonsense. We need these two guys, whether we like them or not, to avoid. We have too many war with Russia, which could become nuclear war, more than we've ever had before. And the people who have contributed to these situations refuse to acknowledge what they've done. Above all, the mainstream media. Above all, the mainstream media. Above all, the mainstream media.
Got it?
What you and I are discussing today should be discussed in the major newspapers and television talk shows in this country nightly. And I guarantee you, decades ago it would have been.
Okay. So I think there's probably one more point. I mean, you have to remember this video is from 2019. So Trump was the president at that point. But as far as America is concerned, as Putin has pointed out, it makes no difference. Whichever president is in, the policies don't change. The presidents change, the policies don't. Follow the money. It's the MIC that run everything, and it's all about weapons and making profit from war, continual war. So I think there's a summing up point here, which I'm going to try and find for you. Right, this was at the point where America was coming up to the next presidential elections. Okay. I'll continue. This will be the final point, I think, of this. Excuse me.
I don't disagree.
They'll converge with Trump on some very dangerous stuff in Iran.
I don't disagree. So, but that brings me to my final point, I guess. Because we are at the time we are in, we now have, I think at last count, 19 or 20 Democratic would-be contenders for the presidential nomination, 19 or 20. We need to ask ourselves which, if any of these people, see these dangers clearly, and ask them, But I have a feeling that the mainstream media will not ask them.
Correct.
Because these are uncomfortable issues for them. I also think that the one candidate who has embraced a position similar to my own,
I thought
Tulsi
so
Gabbard,
too at the time.
was immediately attacked by NBC, as you know, scurrilously. That it's a question of what kind of discussion, because according to our democracy, these existential issues that you and I have discussed are discussed during presidential campaigns. This is when we clarify and make our choices. It seems to me this is unlike.
So he referred to Tulsi Gabbard there, who I have to say at the time during that election campaign, I thought was the only sensible person there. I'm not quite sure of where she's at now. I heard her speaking about God stuff the other day, but nobody's perfect. But he refers to Tulsi Gabbard, and of course, Tulsi Gabbard was ousted. She was disappeared from view because you can't make money from somebody who, the same with Corbyn in the UK, you can't make any money from somebody who's saying we've got to stop all the wars. And so you know who is controlling all this, you know who's calling the shots. And in the next video, I will be discussing another coup, the coup that happened in America, that most people don't even realize happened, but it did. And it needs discussing. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned. There's more coming.